Welcome to Module 10 of Mea Online, Journey Through the Bible. This 10th and final module is titled Outsiders, Women and Non-Israelites. We'll see the wide variety of attitudes that biblical texts show concerning these two groups, women and non-Israelites. And finally, we'll have an opportunity to take a look and see what the implications are of these wide variety of attitudes toward women, toward outsiders, and toward others for contemporary Judaism, as the Bible remains a central text, if not the central text, within contemporary Judaism as well. First, to make an obvious point, there are not only Hebrew men, to use a title of an old book. There are Hebrew women as well. And even though some biblical genealogies seem to suggest that men begat men, obviously then, as in now, it is impossible to beget further generations without women, who then, as now, were approximately half of the ancient Israelite population. Through this course, we've had an opportunity to see a wide variety of stories that deal with women and depict women in a variety of ways. So, for example, the first creation story in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, says very clearly, God created person in his image. In the image of God did he create it. Male and female did he create them. In other words, man and women are created at the same time, created simultaneously, and they are both in the image of God. The second creation story, as we saw, is a little bit different. First, man is created, woman is created later, and what is very significant about this story is after eating from the fruit, God says to the woman, "V'hu yimshol bach." He, the man, will rule over you. We saw a variety of roles of women in the rest of the book of Genesis. In some cases, they are merely pawns in a male's world, but in other cases, the women are extremely active. Think, for example, of Rebekah, who is responsible for making sure that Jacob, the right son, gets the blessing. Similarly, think about the book of Exodus, where, for example, in Exodus chapter 19, verse 15, you have the statement concerning standing before Sinai, and that is where the title of this very important book by Judith Plaskow comes from, where the covenantal people are men only, because there it states that Moses is told to go before the nation. Moses tells the nation, do not go near a woman. Contrast also various notions of women that you have in the book of Proverbs. Please read Proverbs chapter 7 very carefully. There you will see how women are understood as dangerous. That, of course, can be countered within the book of Proverbs by Proverbs chapter 31, which is the section that deals with the woman of valor, the woman of value, the important woman. So even within the book of Proverbs, there is a fair amount of diversity about women and their role. Furthermore, I would encourage you to add the following two texts to your repertoire. Take a look at Jeremiah chapter 44, verses 15 and following, which concerns women and women's worship and the attitude of the text toward particular rituals in which women and not men were engaged. You might think that that is a new feature of religion. That certainly is a very old feature of religion. Furthermore, but not right before you go to sleep, take a look at two of the most problematic texts that the Hebrew Bible has about women, Ezekiel chapter 16 and Ezekiel chapter 23. But I would like to spend most of my time in this unit concerning the three books of Esther, Ruth, and Song of Songs. These books in the Jewish canon are part of the Chamesh Megillot, the 5 scrolls. But I remind you that this is only true of the Jewish order of the Hebrew Bible. If you were to look for these books in a Christian Bible, you'll find them in very different places. Esther and Ruth are both considered to be historical books. So in Christian Bibles, they will be found in the second section of the Old Testament, immediately following books of the Torah. Song of Songs is considered to be a poetic book, and thus it will be found in the third of the four sections of the canon, in the same section that has the book of Psalms or the book of Proverbs. Finally, I'd like to remind you that the book of Esther appears in two forms in Christian Bibles. In Catholic Bibles, it is significantly longer, and therefore in some Catholic Bibles, in the Apocrypha section, you will find so-called additions to the book of. I'd like to begin before talking about the issue of women and the issue of outsiders by offering you some introduction to these various books, beginning with the book of Ruth. We do not know when the book of Ruth was written, although most people now think that it is a post-exilic book. It is a very idyllic love story. There are certain features and parallelisms that come out very clearly in the Hebrew text, which do not come out in the English text. So while the English text does not have a parallelism, a prominent rich man meets a worthy woman, in the Hebrew, these two terms are parallel. A gibor chayil, a prominent rich man, meets an eshet chayil, a worthy woman, and indeed, they live happily ever after. And another symmetry that is part of the book of Ruth concerns the Hebrew word kanaf, which means both wing and cloak. And thus there's quite moving movement within the book of Ruth. From God initially spreads the divine wings under Ruth, and then that is seconded when Boaz spreads his cloak, his knafayim, over Ruth. So again, this is a case where the English, because of the different uses of English and Hebrew words, obscures a lot of the structure and the idyllic nature of the Hebrew. Finally, there are some touching details in the book. So that, for example, during the meal in chapter 2, verse 14, Boaz is very careful to make sure that Ruth is well fed, and indeed gives her this luxury item of roasted grain, and she has her fill, and she even has some left over. It is incredibly important to get away from a Hebrew school understanding of the book of Ruth. And here I refer specifically to Ruth chapter 3, which, if you are not familiar with it, please read it over in the slide. And in the typical understanding, which may even be suitable for youngsters, is that Ruth goes and she uncovers the tippy toes of Boaz. Boaz suddenly gets cold and says, "Oh, who's there? It's Ruth." And ultimately, they end up getting together. But if you read this carefully, something very different is really going on here. Note how, beginning in chapter 3, verse 1, Naomi and Ruth are working together, where Naomi says to her daughter-in-law that she needs to find a place where she will be happy. She tells him that Boaz, who is related somehow by marriage, is going to be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Now, if Ruth just needed to uncover the toes of Boaz, she did not need to bathe, anoint herself, and get all dressed up. But that is what she needs to do in verse 3. And she is also told there not to disclose herself to anyone. Finally, in verse 4, she is told when he lies down, make sure to realize where he lies down and to uncover, in this translation, his feet. Now, the Hebrew word his feet, which we actually saw in a slightly different form in Isaiah chapter 6, where the angels used two of their wings to uncover cover their feet is a euphemism for Boaz's genitalia. And thus, what she is being told here is, see where he lies down, because you better be sure you get the right guy, and uncover him up to his waist. She does that. Verse 7 makes it very clear that Boaz is a little drunk. He's in a cheerful mood. And in the middle of the night, verse 8, the man gave a start and pulled back. There was a woman lying at his feet. Okay, think of this perhaps even in fraternity terms. He's a little shocked. Who are you? She tells him who he is. And Boaz is a gentleman, unlike what typically happens in fraternities. He gets really nervous at this point. He finds Ruth in bed next to him. He is half undressed. The place of his feet is revealed, and he suddenly starts to wonder, oh my God, what happened to me when I drank a little bit too much? And because he's a gentleman, he is incredibly concerned, and he makes sure that he is going to marry Ruth as soon as possible, as the rest of the book notes. But what is this book? How should we take it? Should this book be a historical book in the sense of a narrative set in the past, which attempts to recount the past, or is it merely, to recall my definition, a narrative about a past which is not meant to be history? I think that this book hints that it is not meant to be historical. It starts with a strange irony. It is set in Bethlehem. Hebrew Beit Lechem means house of bread or house of food. But in the very first verse, there is a famine in the house of food. The names of various people are very odd. One person who dies is named Machlon, which means sickness. Another is named Kilion. Naomi is names means sweetness. Naomi's daughter-in-law, who does not stay with her, is named Orpah, which means back, and in this case means back turner. These are good indications that this book was not meant to be taken historically. Instead, the main point of this book that I will return to later is that kindness is more important than ethnicity. This is very different than the text that we saw in Ezra and Nehemiah, which stress that intermarriage is forbidden, specifically the text in Ezra, which views Israel as holy seed. Finally, this book repeats a pattern that you see often in the Hebrew Bible. God works behind the scene. It just so happens that Naomi and Ruth find the field of Boaz. It just so happens at the beginning of chapter 4 that the Redeemer walks by. Thus, a major theme of many biblical texts is things that seem to just so happen, do not just so happen at all, but God's hand is visible even when it seems to be invisible.